It's been almost 1 year since the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. A state of emergency is currently in effect in the city, although organizers were unable to get a permit for another rally this year. But a white nationalist rally is planned in Washington, D.C. this weekend. Government and police officials say they are confident they can prevent violence this time around. To talk about this, we have the National Director and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. Thank you for coming in to talk about this very important topic. Sunday's DC event is permitted for about 400 people. Do you think that's an accurate number, and who will be among them?
Well, we're right now tracking the next Unite the Right rally that's slated to happen this weekend in DC. That number sounds about right to us, but we'll really have to watch this very carefully. It will clearly be smaller than what happened last year, but it still has the potential to be dangerous. Specifically
because you also have counter demonstrators who will be just as passionate out as well. Law enforcement officials say that they are prepared, but what is the risk here?
Well, the risk is that, first of all, this is a convening of right-wing nationalists who have a tendency toward hate and violence. And we've seen this again and again. If you look at the extremist murders in the U.S. over the last quarter century, almost 75% that happened here in the U.S. were committed by right-wing extremists. And so I would really say that last year Charlottesville was a warning sign for us. It was an APB about what can happen when extremists take center stage. So they come with a tendency toward violence, and then, as you said, combine anti-fascist protesters and radical folks from the radical left who are also prone to violence, and it could be, Errol, extremely combustible.
What do you make of the debate around making space for white nationalists to exercise their First Amendment rights? Some people, I mean, whether it's college campuses, on the Twitter platform or on social media and in debates, some people say, well, they may have racist views, but they're allowed to spew them. Is it the same as anyone else voicing their opinion? And do you think they should have the space to make this kind of argument?
Well, I'll tell you, at the ADL, we're fierce advocates for the First Amendment. We've been fighting hate for over 100 years, and we have to be willing to tolerate hateful speech under the rubric of the First Amendment. So the fact of the matter is, yes, we feel like they have the right to say what they're going to say. The best response to such bad speech is better speech. So unless they're inciting violence, unless they're suggesting that we would threaten people and harm them physically, we have to give them a space to speak. But the question is, how do you do it so that we protect the public safety of all Americans? And that's incumbent upon the authorities.
And it's that threat of violence that really crosses the red line, you say. Since 2017, the ADL has tallied the number of extremist incidents nationwide.
That's right.
What are you seeing? What's the trend line?
Well, look, whether you can attribute it to the explosion of social media, which becomes a cesspool for this kind of hateful rhetoric, or maybe the divisive state of our national politics, extremism is on the rise. So we track anti-Semitic incidents at the ADL. We saw a 57% increase in 2017. That's the highest spike that we have seen in this organization in 40 years. That's on top of what we saw, a 34% increase in 2016. I'm talking about acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence. And that's just against Jews. The FBI itself tracks a more than 5% increase in hate crimes overall against all groups, with very large increases, for example, against the Muslim community, a 19% increase in 2016. So there is something happening here. It's not just anecdote. Empirically, we know it's a real problem.
President Trump is voicing more displeasure at black NFL players kneeling than he does at white supremacists. And last year he famously said that in Charlottesville there were fine people on both sides.
Yeah.
What impact does that have?
Well, I think whether you're the president of your local PTA or the president of the United States of America, people in leadership positions need to lead. And we would hope that the president would find a way in this moment right now not to focus on NFL players, but to focus on those extremists who want to tear apart the country.
You know, many of them often are Trump supporters. That doesn't mean that all Trump supporters are racist, but there's something happening when you have people like David Duke and other admitted racists saying that they support the policies and the rhetoric of President Trump. What is leadership on this issue? What should that look like?
Well, I think our commander-in-chief has a responsibility to hold people accountable for their words and their actions. And he can use his bully pulpit to lead the country to suggest, no, there are no fine people among neo-Nazis. Not really sure why there's any question about that. And he can talk about how do we bring the country together. I think that's what he said he would do in 2016 when he was elected. I think that's what the country is craving, that kind of leadership. We hope it will happen this weekend.
And let's say President Trump doesn't have this enlightened moment and change his tune on this issue. You know, we all see these viral videos of people being racist towards the woman at the nail salon or someone out in public. What's the responsibility for the rest of us when we witness this? What should people do?
It's a great question. I think when we see intolerance, we need to interrupt it when it happens.
Even if we're not directly involved?
For sure. I mean, I think when you see something play out like that, there is no room for bystanders, only for upstanders. So we've got to speak out, whether it happens, you know, at the water cooler at work, or at the table at a Thanksgiving dinner, or literally in front of you in a public place. Standing up for someone who's being attacked, getting in front of someone who's being abusive. We all have the power to stop this kind of intolerance when we see it take place.
You mentioned that you're tracking an increase in domestic terrorism, white nationalist sentiment. Are you hopeful at all, based on what you're seeing right now, that that tide is turning or will turn soon?
Well, it's funny, if you look at our website at adl.org, we've just put up a really interesting heat map of all the violent extremist incidents over the last 20 years. It's pretty interesting because you can see trends and patterns. And there is indeed some very troubling data when you look at it. But pull back the lens for just a moment. America today is a more tolerant, it is a more respectful, it is a more pluralistic country than we've ever had in the history of our nation and perhaps in the history of the world. So indeed, over the last 20 years and in the last several months, there have been some really painful points. But the arc of history does indeed bend toward justice, and I'm encouraged when I realize how far we've come.
All right, I appreciate you ending on that note. Jonathan Greenblatt, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.